Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Many of us view death as something to avoid at all costs, to where an overwhelming majority of our popular media even portray death as an obstacle to either avoid or overcome. But experts argue that there's actually a positive side to mortality awareness, and that's exactly what we aim to talk about today. And to guide us through this, we're speaking to social scientist Kimberly Wade-Benzoni, who is currently a professor of management and organizations, as well as a Center of Leadership and Ethics scholar at Duke University. In the past, Kimberly has contributed to research exploring how death priming influences intergenerational decision-making and promotes beneficence towards future generations, as well as research examining legacy reflection and how it influences motivations and behaviors. So we're really fortunate to have her on the show with us today. Welcome to the show, Kimberly.
Thank you, Marie.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, and I'm really keen to talk about this. I feel like it's definitely something that people should discuss a little bit more. But to start, I would love to know a bit more about your background and what compelled you to pursue this area of social sciences.
Well, generally, what compelled me to pursue social sciences more generally, my undergraduate degree was in electrical engineering, and my first job was in a management training program where I worked at a large company and different functional areas and different parts of the company for a couple years. And as a result of my experience observing organizational life and navigating my way through it, I wanted to better understand the psychology of human behavior, particularly in organizations. And once I figured out you could do that for a living as a social scientist, I went back to graduate school to get my PhD in organizational behavior, which is an area in the field of business that's really a confluence of different social sciences, incorporating psychology, sociology, and behavioral economics.
Yeah, that's a really interesting background. I love that so much. So in your view, in your experience, what is the importance of mortality awareness? Why do you believe it's important to discuss and understand?
Well, death awareness is a universal human experience, and it has profound effects on human behavior. People spend a lot of time either thinking about death or not thinking about death.
Yeah, well, that's a great introduction for our topic for today. I'm not sure about other people, but I do spend quite a bit of time thinking about death. But before we get further into detail, I would love to get to know you better. So this is Have You Met Kimberly? And this will be a rapid fire style icebreaker. So I will say a word and just hit me with whatever comes to mind. Book.
Well, it's hard to pick just one book, but I can mention a couple. In terms of influential and impactful, I read 1984 in high school for the first time and reread it a couple of times as a young adult and again with my kids when they were reading it in high school. To mention one that's more recent that I would recommend, there's a book called The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben. It's nonfiction. He's a forester who writes about the science that shows us how trees communicate, feel, and how forests are social networks of their own.
And movie?
Nomadland, because it's honest about the nature of human life and it's sort of literary.
Podcasts?
I tend to listen to podcasts that I'm going to be on so I can get a better sense of what's expected from me. So a few episodes from The Behavioral Divide, The Long Time Academy, Sideways, Meekles and Dimes.
Role model?
There's not one person I would consider my role model, but there's numerous people I admire and gain inspiration from. I can take this as an opportunity to note a couple of people who have been exemplar in many ways. First, I learned a lot about what's involved with being an impactful scholar and a responsible collaborator from two scholars who I worked with early in my career, Max Bazerman and Ann Tenbrunsel. And second, real quick, it took me a long time in my life to recognize and understand how my parents have impacted my life through their good example of taking the long view, being financially conservative, unmaterialistic, trying to make things better for future generations, and understanding love as a commitment.
Yeah. And what about a course or class that you've taken that has stuck with you to this date?
Well, since I'm a professor, I teach the courses, and I'm going to mention the course that I most recently taught, which is Navigating Organizations. And I do learn a lot from my students, so I'm going to answer that way.
And what is the most important lesson that you've learned from all of what you've just shared with us?
Let's see. How about this one? Just to be funny, podcasts are a great way to fall asleep, and don't worry too much if you get rambly at the end of the podcast interview, if you don't like the way the end came out, because no one actually gets to the end if the podcast is working the way it should. How about that?
Yeah, I do think that podcasts are so good because when it's in the conversational style, it's really raw and messy, and that's okay. But yeah, and sometimes you fall asleep. That's all right too. It doesn't mean it was bad. It just means that you have a good voice that puts people to sleep, right?
Or it helps to take away that anxiety that keeps us awake.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's good. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. It's been a pleasure to get to know you a little bit better. Now, I think it's the perfect time to move on to the main portion of our interview, where we will start off with answering some theoretical questions. And we do like to start with defining some basic key terms. So for starters, how would you define happiness?
So I think most people think of happiness as an emotional state of feeling joy, satisfaction, or fulfillment, or an agreeable feeling of contentment, a state of calm, or an absence of anxiety.
Yeah. And because we are talking about death or mortality awareness today, what would you say is your definition of that?
I think of death awareness as a psychological state in which people are conscious of their mortality.
And overall, how would you describe the relationship between happiness and mortality awareness?
Generally, when people remember that they're going to die, they experience some anxiety, which interferes with that agreeable emotional state that we understand as happiness.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know you briefly talked a little bit about the importance of understanding mortality awareness in the introduction of the podcast. But what would you say is the importance of understanding it for our happiness? How would understanding it lead to that?
The problem with death is that it calls into question life meaning. It makes people wonder, what's the point of life if we all die in the end? And I think it can be processed constructively in a more transcendent way. Focusing explicitly on happiness can interfere with attaining it. So if instead people focus on finding life meaning and purpose, they'll probably have a better chance of experiencing whatever the closest thing to the experience of happiness is humanly possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And apart from happiness, what are the benefits of confronting mortality?
I think this might be a good place to articulate to the listeners how my research is related to death and life meaning so that they can put my comments in context. And it will also help to answer some of these questions in the process. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. My research focuses on understanding the psychology of intergenerational decisions and answering the question, what motivates the present generation to act on the behalf of future generations, particularly when doing so involves a trade-off between self-interest in the present and the interests of others in the future. As part of a larger program of research, we found that death awareness can help to promote intergenerational beneficence. Why is that? Well, when we're reminded about death, we remember that we don't want to die. We want to live. But we understand that death is inevitable, and that fact can create an existential dilemma in light of our deeply rooted survival instinct. And one of the most effective things we can do to buffer our anxiety about death is to attempt to transcend it by finding meaning in our lives. And central to this meaning is that we have had impact that persists beyond our physical existence. People feel better in the face of death if they're part of something that will live on after them. And having a positive impact on future generations can help fulfill that need, because it helps people to build a legacy which offers a little bit of symbolic immortality and helps to make life meaningful.
Yeah, that is really interesting because there are all sorts of ways in which people leave legacies, right? Some people like to go for leaving legacies in the sense of I need to make a name for myself, career wise, or what have you, and some people go for more like family heirloom style. I'm gonna leave this to my future what's the word, descendants, or like children, grandchildren, what have you, right? Family rings get passed on, and so on and so forth. But I'm curious about the other side of that, which is like the anxiety that comes with confronting mortality. How, like, what are the potential downsides of facing mortality and death?
Yep. I think this is a good place to make a distinction between the different forms of death awareness, which can be experienced quite differently in either an anxious or reflective state. In the anxious state, people are very emotional and apprehensive. It's very visceral and leads people to be focused on self-protection, and it can interfere with well-being. But in contrast, people can experience death awareness in a more reflective state, which is more cognitive and analytical, and can promote more durable and pro-social behaviors, which can help people to find life meaning and connection with others.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, how was this shown through the research that you did?
Well, the we mostly looked at this theoretically and conceptually. So the paper that you read was a conceptual paper that integrated two different literatures with a lot of empirical findings. The terror management theory literature, which primarily looks at what we call death anxiety, and how priming people or getting people to think about death causes them to be in this self-protective and more, narrower sort of focusing on it, more narrower in group, where in contrast, there's a separate literature on generativity, which looks at how when people are nearing the end of their life, they think back on what makes their life meaningful, and it tends to result in a more sort of positive and other-oriented reaction.
Yeah. And so could you go further into detail about like the specific struggles that people tend to face when it comes to confronting mortality?
So the problem with death is that it threatens life meaning, and people ask themselves, what's the point of life if we all just die in the end? It creates a lot of existential anxiety. But focusing on a legacy how to leave a legacy can be helpful, because leaving a legacy allows us to continue to have an impact even after we're gone. It connects us to something beyond ourselves that will continue to exist after us, such as future generations. It gives us a little bit of symbolic immortality, and it helps to assuage the constant death anxiety and provides us with life meaning. When we leave a positive legacy, we've made a difference. We've made some sort of contribution.
How would you recommend managing or overcoming these struggles? What are some very like different specific ways that you've seen people leave their legacies behind? Are there any different ways apart from just leaving a legacy?
There's lots of different ways to leave a legacy. And in our research, we try to come up with ways to give people the space to come up with the path forward that is the most meaningful to them. So first, thinking about death is inherently uncomfortable, but it doesn't have to be negative or unproductive. And also getting outside your comfort zone does tend to lead to personal growth. Contemplating death through legacy reflection is less harsh and a more holistic way to approach it. It helps people to think through and keep in mind long-term goals. That helps to make their lives meaningful. And it also allows them the space to sort out, you sort of sort that out according to their own values and preferences. And it's a holistic way to incorporate multiple goals and figure out how they fit together and what's most important. I think one thing that might qualify as an unpopular opinion that I didn't mention up front, which is that I don't think that, focusing on happiness is necessarily the most constructive approach to finding happiness. So I think an overly focusing on happiness can get in the way of happiness. And, life is probably more about meaning and purpose, and thinking about your legacy is one thing that really helps to get you to help you to accomplish that, figuring out your life meaning and purpose. And our research doesn't try to nudge people in one direction or another. And there's not one right way to leave a legacy. Some people want to create a good life for their children, and other people want to create something new. They want to write a book, they want to found an organization, or they just want to promote a certain beneficial set of values in society. All these things are perfectly legitimate ways of leaving a legacy. So,
yeah, I really like that take. I think like part of it is definitely like, watching a watch pot never boils. And then the second part of it is also just like there's a very, I think, such an overgeneralized idea or notion of happiness. People take that happiness and try to like spread it out and be like, we can achieve this like perpetual state of happiness, when in reality we are experiencing an array of emotions every single day, and so like it's okay if you're not happy for a second or like a few minutes in a day. That's just part of life, right? Like that's just the human experience. So thank you for sharing that with us. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask was that your paper does note the distinction between death anxiety and death reflection, which is something that you also did mention pretty briefly. But tell us a bit more about the differences between the two, and what might be more productive to think about in the sense of just strengthening our sense of well-being.
Mm-hmm. So when people are in a state of death anxiety, they experience fear, panic, and dread about their own mortality. It's processed in what we call an emotionally hot experiential system. People are very impulsive, visceral, intuitive. It tends to have intense, short-lived effects and leads to self-protective reactions. In contrast, death reflection, individuals put their lives in context. They contemplate their meaning and purpose and review how others will look upon them after they've passed. It's processed in what we call a more cool cognitive system, more deliberate, analytical, rational, intentional, and systematic. It leads to milder, more durable changes in behavior and strengthens pro-social motivations. One thing I can say is that in some recent and ongoing research, which we're in the middle of, so it's not something published, but we have, since the conceptual paper that you read, we have tried very hard to separate death anxiety from death reflection empirically. And I can say it's very difficult to do. And the more accurate model is probably that everyone experiences death anxiety, and then they either get stuck there or figure out how to stop thinking about it, or they advance into this more constructive, productive state of death reflection, which is what we have been working on, trying to develop a specific intentional legacy reflection exercise that people can do. So as I mentioned, kind of winding back to the conceptual piece and the death reflection coming from this literature called Generativity, and it focuses on how, as people approach the end of their lives, the fact that, because of age or potentially because of terminal illness, they that acts as a natural death prime. There's no way. It's much harder not to think about death when you are 97. But at that point, then what people do, then they do think, they get in a death reflective state and they think about their legacy, but they do it in hindsight. They think about the story that's already happened, and they have to create this narrative in hindsight. What makes my life meaningful? And they sort of interpret the story that's already happened. But what we're trying to do in our current research is to encourage people, not to wait until there's not a lot of time left at any point in your life, as early as possible, but really at any point in any context. If you, there's ways to actually intentionally reflect on the legacy you want to leave, and then you can align your behaviors and decisions and create the legacy in a forward-looking way.
Yeah, well, that's really insightful. So thank you for sharing that. That really reminds me of how like my grandmother, towards her latest years, she started talking about how she's not going to dye her hair anymore because she won't be around for very long, so there's no point in that. But it wasn't really from a place of like sadness. It was just kind of like matter of fact. Would you say this is something that's like really common to see?
So it sounds like she has already gone through a death reflective state and thought process. And also, gray is kind of in style. My 23-year-old students dye their hair gray, so it became kind of cool and stylish during the pandemic. But anyway, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I'm not gonna lie. Like, gray is a pretty cool hair color, and
It's cool.
It is really cool. So the other thing I was really curious about too is that your paper mentions the tragedies of September 11th, and how that event led many people to reevaluate their lives and pursue more meaningful work. And for those who are unaware, September 11th was a series of attacks in 2001 in the US, where airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City, as well as the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and at a field in Pennsylvania somewhere, killing total about 3,000 civilians, if I'm not mistaken. But it was just a really impactful, negatively impactful, I guess, a memorable event that in U.S. history. But what I'm curious about is what is it about confronting death that can inspire such profound changes in career paths and personal values?
Okay, so the idea is that the thought of death threatens life meaning. So if we all die in the end, what makes life meaningful? So when people are confronted with death, they think, well, what makes my life meaningful? And then this point that you mentioned, that after 9/11, people changed their careers and they decided they wanted to do other things. They thought more about, what's going to make my life meaningful, and that's the reaction. That's the change in the career path. So if people feel like they've made a difference, if they've had a purpose, then it helps to assuage some of that death anxiety, and it gives them a little bit of symbolic immortality. So when you've made a difference, when you've connected yourself to others, and in our work, we look at how the legacy can connect people with future generations. And once you're connected to something that lives on after you, it gives you a little bit of that symbolic immortality, which takes away a lot of the anxiety, or at least assuages the anxiety having to do with death, because the idea is you want to live on, and that gives you a way to live on. So I hope that helped.
Yeah, well, I haven't really been through a near-death scenario or anything like what people in that situation went through. But from what I imagine, I like if I was one of the remaining people standing, I would be left with like this great sense of like gratitude of like, wow, I'm still alive. I need to do something to give back to the world and to give back to like life itself. And that gratitude, that importance of gratitude as a pathway to happiness is something that positive psychology often reiterates as well. So in what ways do you think this reflecting on our legacy and the confrontation with death can contribute to that gratitude?
Okay, so I'm going to share with you a fun fact, which is that before I joined Duke, I worked at New York University, and I was living in Manhattan in 2001. So I did watch the towers go down, and I was there. So for whatever it's worth, I'm just going to put that out there. So in terms of gratitude, my research does find that one important factor that affects our intergenerational behavior and legacy building behaviors is our experience and perceptions of the legacy we've inherited from previous generations. So when we believe we've benefited from the choices and behavior of the previous generations, that gets us thinking about what we want to leave for the next generation. And while we can't always reciprocate the good or bad left to us by the previous generation, we can pay it forward by behaving similarly to the next generation. So that's how I see gratitude coming into play in this story.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely a stage I had to reach after like petulant teenage phase, where like as a teenager I didn't really see any of the like benefits of just life itself, apart from like I have to go to school, have to do exams, and I don't want to, like, I didn't ask for this, right? But then as an adult, I like noticed more things that my parents and grandparents gave to me and that I benefited from and that I was so fortunate to have growing up. And that's when I kind of like think more about like giving back to the world and community around me, what have you. Would you say that that's like similar to what you're referencing here?
Yeah, I mean, we actually have done a lot of empirical research that looks at a phenomenon called intergenerational reciprocity, where the behavior and beneficence and generosity of the previous generation very consistently across all kinds of contexts and participant populations leads people to then act on the behalf of future generations. The one note I should make, though, is that it is a double-edged sword. So if we perceive that the previous generation did bad things to us, it can backfire.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's like kind of where my head was as like a petulant teenager and probably many as well. And hopefully, it is just like a stage for some people. But for those people who just view it that way, or for people who just avoid thinking about death altogether, how would you address those perspectives and viewing death as like inherently negative or uncomfortable?
First, thinking about death is inherently uncomfortable, but it doesn't have to be negative or unproductive. And getting outside your comfort zone does tend to lead to personal growth. By avoiding thinking about death, you only assuage death anxiety. It always is there. It always kind of remains. A constructive way to process death is through legacy reflection. And I would recommend a specific legacy reflection exercise, which can be done at any point in life, at any time.
Yeah, do tell us about that legacy reflection exercise. What are some effective ways to start?
Okay. So here's what we do in our research, and we found that it has all kinds of beneficial outcomes, both for the individual and for other people. So we ask people to think about the impact they want to have on future generations, and then to write about it for a few minutes, even just half a page. But sometimes I have a teaching version of the exercise, which I'll tell you about, and it could be a few minutes, 15 minutes, doesn't have to take a long time. Think about how you would like to be remembered by future generations, what you'd like to leave behind, and how you would like your actions, decisions, and behaviors to affect future generations in a lasting way. It sounds very simple, but that's what makes it good. It's practical, it's simple, and we have empirically shown that it can help increase life meaning. It helps people to be more long-term other-oriented, more other-oriented, helps them to think about what makes their life meaningful, think about their goals in holistic ways, be more inclusive in how they think about other people and who should benefit from their own decisions and behaviors. And it just leads to more well-being.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to talk further into detail about this during the practices and habits segment as well. We'll go more into the day-to-day application of reflecting on death. But for now, could you share with us just one key insight with listeners about why confronting mortality matters, and what would that be?
I wouldn't use the language confronting mortality. I would say instead, try to process death in a constructive way. Death is inevitable. It's a universal experience, and the fact of death can and does cause people to have existential crisis. And we recommend a structured legacy reflection task that helps people to process it constructively, improves well-being, helps people to think about life meaning and to choose a path, behaviors and decisions that helps them to craft their life story, their legacy in an intentional and forward-looking way. One key insight, don't focus on happiness, focus on meaning. Pursuing life meaning and purpose will end up bringing more happiness, or that's what I believe. I guess I should say that's my opinion. Then an explicit focus on happiness, or something more important than happiness, which I think is meaning and legacy. The process of creating life meaning and pursuing a life purpose can and often does involve discomfort and pain, loss, hard work, setbacks, strain, and so forth, which may not feel like what people expect when they're striving for happiness, but it's more important, and it's what life is about.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. It honestly sounds like a really exciting project to start on, just planning out what your legacy is, and just thinking about all the things that bring you and your life meaning. But for now, let's take a break and let's jump into our break segment called Worst Case Scenario. And this is where our guest, Kimberly here, will be outlining the worst possible outcomes of failing to tend to a particular issue, in this case, mortality awareness. And this is aimed at giving the listeners an idea of the effects of a particular issue may have on themselves. So, Kimberly, let's say that an individual doesn't necessarily want to reflect or confront their mortality. What's the worst case scenario that this individual may face?
I don't think avoiding reflecting on death is a worst case scenario, since one of the most common things people do to buffer death anxiety is to find ways to avoid thinking about death. Many people do this effectively throughout their lives, and some may even argue that this approach to life can help protect feelings of happiness. The worst case scenario that I could think of is this. People start believing that humans will become extinct in the relatively near future. This goes beyond one's own death awareness and implies the death of an entire species. In this scenario, the whole legacy reflection theory falls apart, and it becomes much more difficult to find a way to transform death awareness into something constructive. The idea with creating a legacy is to live on in some way or form through the impact on future others. But if there are no future others, then what? Well, figuring that out is part of our future empirical agenda. And it might involve connecting yourself to something even larger, such as a universal consciousness, immortal artificial intelligence, the earth, nature, or the universe more broadly, or some conception of God.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I mean, personally, I'm kind of okay if my legacy leads to nowhere. Like, I'm all right with it. But for like, what is your? Do you have a hypothesis on what a good alternative to leaving a legacy for no one to be, or what people should start thinking about instead of the firm belief that humans are going to cease to exist in the near future?
Well, the people who I know who think that humans will become extinct shortly and are not worried about the legacy, they do still think that whatever time they have should have meaning, and that meaning is typically connected to making things better for the people around them that they care about. And, if those people continue to live on past you, then you have left a legacy, or, whatever impact you've had on whatever community, be that human or not human, that is something.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And we did take a little bit of a detour there, but just to bring it back to worst case scenario, what do you think? So the scenario that we've outlined here is that a lot of people are to believe that humans are going to cease to exist in the near future, and the legacy like theory kind of falls apart. What is the worst case scenario if that happened? Is it just like the legacy conception?
Okay, so first, I don't think a lot of people think that. I think I said that was like, it's the worst case scenario for my theory and my research program. And also what it does is it takes away this constructive way of processing death, which I put out there, which I think is, we have actually a lot of research now showing how much it benefits the individual who goes through this legacy reflection and those around them. So it leads to both individual, organizational, and group and societal benefits, and we have yet to find a downside. So the worst case scenario is now we've taken away that prescription. Then what? Then what do we do? Well, I think it's an empirical question. It's something now we've thought about. Let's put it out there, and then you have to find ways maybe to get people, instead of connecting themselves to future others, to something that's beyond themselves that may or may not have to do with humans. So, I think AI is a really interesting future direction, but I can't really speak about it empirically because we haven't done that research, and we just thought of this like yesterday. So I'm not going to be able to talk about it that much, but I do think it's an interesting thing to start thinking about, and important probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I personally think that space would be an interesting exploration for the future. Not that I can do anything in space, but it definitely is like somewhere out there in the future, Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I really appreciate it. It's been such a fascinating conversation. Now let's go into the practices and habits segment of the show, where we talk about more of the day-to-day application of what you've just shared with us. So just before, you did mention a legacy reflection exercise. Would you mind going further into depth about that? How would it be broken down into simple steps?
Okay, so this is actually specifically what we give people to do when we run our experiments. We ask them to think about the impact you want to have on future generations, and then to write about it for a few minutes or a half a page. Think about how you'd like to be remembered by future generations, what you'd like to leave behind, and how you would like your actions, decisions, and behaviors to affect future generations in a lasting way. But let me give you another version of this. On the last day of the courses I teach, I have my students who are at the beginning of their careers imagine that they're at the end of their careers and that they're going to retire, and that day they're going to be honored as Leader of the Year. Their closest colleague will be giving a speech about them. And then I have the students write that speech. And I just give them a few minutes, 10 or 15, and they see what comes to mind. And they find it transformational because this isn't something people do naturally. They get so busy with their homework, with their job searches, and they forget, what's this all about anyway? It brings the big picture back in sight, but in a very concrete way. It helps them to discover, what comes to the forefront when I ask myself that question. What do I want people to be saying about me in the end? If they, if I'm so successful, they write a book about me, what do I want to be in that book? What's most important, about how they want to be remembered and what kind of impact do they want to have? It's a soft version of write your own obituary. So if we can get everyone to sit down and write their own obituary, they would probably be a lot more thoughtful about the decisions that they're making. But we have our legacy reflection task is a soft, holistic version of that. It's a more, it's a more palatable one, and it's one that you can actually implement in organizations.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, and that actually reminds me of like how at some point in the episode I did say like I don't care if I leave a legacy, like who cares? But if I really think about it, like and outline what I want to be said in my obituary, I would like some pretty nice things to be said in my obituary. So in a sense, I do want to leave like a legacy in the form of like nice memories. I don't want people to be like this person was horribly messy and dirty all the time, never washed dishes, anything like that. Well, I wouldn't mind it so much, but it's just like not as pleasant of a memory, not necessarily something I want to be put on my tombstone, But apart from the legacy reflection exercise, what are some other habits or exercises that you'd recommend practicing for mortality or death awareness?
I mean, for me, that's the big one. If we could get people to do that even once, it's huge because people go through their whole lives. In fact, I had been doing this research for years and never really did it myself. And then one time I pre-test like my own surveys and experimental materials. And sometimes I usually like skip through that. But one time I actually did it and I was kind of surprised about what came out. So I'm going to reinforce that sitting down and answering those questions. Think about how you want to be remembered. People have different ideas about what legacy means. For some people, it's about tangible resources, leaving an inheritance for their children. For some people, it's just making the world a better place or in any way they can. For some people, it's more about the values. For some people, it's about their reputation. So you said you don't want to be remembered as a person who didn't clean the kitchen or didn't do the dishes. So, it can be just about your reputation. So I think it's huge. And that would be the thing for myself. I mean, I don't have a lot of time to experience death anxiety because I'm so busy, like taking care of my kids and doing my job. And my biggest death anxiety is that if I die, like, how's my family going to take care of themselves? So, what practices do I do? I mean, and this is very common. People keep themselves busy, which I guess is one way to just like not think about it. But I also spend a lot of time thinking about legacy. And I think, that's the big one. So I'm going back to that, and some good things about that practice. Even if you don't care about your legacy, it helps you to set goals on a long time horizon and in a holistic way, which is good for anyone, regardless of what you think about legacy. It helps you to figure out what gives your life meaning, and that could make your days better, the days of your life better. And it helps you to process death constructively, which is going to help assuage the anxiety that interferes with those feelings of happiness.
And what do you think are some common challenges or struggles that people might face when attempting to just sit down and think about their legacy a little bit, apart from the time piece, of course?
Okay, so the biggest challenge is, and I mean this very seriously, people don't do it until the end of their lives. And then you're left with making sense of a story that's already happened, as the generativity literature has told us. Instead, reflect on your legacy now at whatever place in life that is for you. And then you can make choices and engage in behaviors that enable you to make that vision a reality. You have more choice in creating your own legacy. And in terms of the time piece, it doesn't take long. This is something I have my students do in a few minutes. Even if you just do it once, write it on your phone when you're waiting in line for something. Use your voice memo feature, or instead of watching those 10 YouTube videos that are just wasting your time, do that instead. So I don't think that's an obstacle at all.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I think it's really I like it so much because it ties really well into other topics that we've talked about in the sphere of happiness, where we talk a lot about mindfulness and intentionality, right? And sitting down and reflecting on your legacy, that doesn't happen by accident. It takes intentionality to like sit down, think about the kind of person you want to be, the kind of person that you want to be remembered as, and then live out your life that way. So that is just really eye-opening to me. So thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise with us. Now let's move on to the open mic segments. And this is where you get the opportunity to talk about anything that you're passionate about. And it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is all yours. Take it away.
Well, this is going to sound really nerdy, but I'm very passionate about my work and continuing to understand the psychology of legacies and how we can transform those insights to find ways to improve outcomes to individuals, organizations, and society. The study of legacies brings together a lot of different intellectual perspectives, incorporates elements of psychology, philosophy, behavioral economics, and so forth. So that's one thing I'm very passionate about. I'm passionate about the natural environment. I'm passionate about writing of all sorts, scientific writing stories, and I'm passionate about protecting privacy and choice and freedom of thought. Going back to reading 1984 as a young adult. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent use of the open mic. Thank you once again, Kimberly, for joining us today. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Okay, so speaking of privacy, this is one of my unpopular opinions that I think invisibility is a superpower. So I have opted out of all forms of social media from the get-go. I am not even on LinkedIn. But you can go to the Duke University Fuqua School of Business website, and you can find my faculty page there. And if you, the best way to learn about my work is to read the academic research, and you can find that through Google Scholar. If you Google Scholar my name, you will get all my publications. You get a lot of them.
Fantastic. We'll leave those in the show note. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.